The following is a Shaw Public Affairs presentation.
Adrian Dix has two choices. He can vote in favor of a motion that will bind the government, the federal and provincial governments, to lowering people's sales tax to 10% from 12%, or he can vote against a motion that would bind future governments to lowering your taxes from 12% to 10%. And I'm not surprised he's going to vote against it.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and the legislature has wrapped up for another year, at least for another spring anyway. Last week we had Government House Leader on the show, Rich Coleman. Tonight we have two members of the New Democratic Party opposition. Welcome to the show, Shane Simpson. Thanks for being on.
Good to be here, Vaughn.
And the NDP House Leader, John Horgan.
Good to see you, Vaughn.
Mr. Coleman's counterpart. Do you find this year's session much different from last year's?
Well, it certainly was for me. I had to do some diplomacy and some stick handling with the Liberals, and last session I just threw punches and elbows. So it was a different approach for me, but I quite enjoyed it. And I think overall, Rich Coleman and I did a pretty good job of managing the business of the House. It was the shortest session in a long, long time.
24 days.
24 days. So only two other legislatures sat for less time, Nunavut and Prince Edward Island. The Northwest Territories sat for longer than we did. So with that in mind, and the fact that the government did use closure, and we had a debate on a treaty for 5 hours rather than the 150 hours that we did on the Nisga'a Treaty, overall I'd have to say that we did a reasonably good job in a partisan environment of getting through some of the public's business and managing the House to the best of our ability. I had a good time doing it. I enjoyed it a lot.
Shane Simpson, both sides came back to the House with new leaders too. What do you make of that?
Well, it did, and the dynamic obviously has changed a lot with Premier Clark, with Adrian Dix. It does change the dynamic, it changes the personality. I think that became really evident in the last week when Ms. Clark was there. She showed up for the last 4 days because of the by-election, was in the House for a few days there, and I think we then saw some of the dynamic, and it was the first chance to contrast the two of them. But I think it's energized. It's certainly energized the parties. It's energized our party and our caucus, and I think we're looking forward to getting to what is likely to be an election sooner rather than later.
I would say I agree with you. I think, but it's not just because an election's in the air. I would say that both Dix and Clark are just more political. They came up through political parties, party apparatus. They just think more partisan, more political, and I think you're seeing a livelier political debate between the two of them.
Well, I think that there's some truth to that for sure, and there's quite a contrast. Adrian is a pretty thoughtful guy. He's always well read on any topic that he's dealing with. That's his style. People talk about Premier Clark as a good communicator, though maybe not quite as deep on some of those issues. So they bring very contrasting styles, I think, too, and we saw some of that, I think, beginning to reflect itself in the debate.
Both parties, John Horgan, when the session ended, said there'll be a fall session. Both, I think, are expecting that they'll be calling it after winning a provincial election.
Well, I think that's the only way you can guarantee, on our side, that we could guarantee a fall session is if we're the government and we call it. I've been in the legislature for 6 years. There's been a fixed calendar for every single year of that time. And I can't remember one fall where we have completely sat through as the calendar dictates. We didn't sit at all last year. 10 months without a sitting last year from June right through to late April. So that is unheard of, even in an election year, to have so few sitting days. But the challenge is we need to make the legislature relevant to people again. And I think that one of the challenges, and Shane touched upon this, is the fierce partisanship that we see with Christy Clark and Adrian. And the noise in the legislature, and I think you would agree, was louder than it had been in a long, long time. And I think the Speaker just basically let us play. Go ahead, make your noise. If that's what you want to do, it's your house. Have at it. And I don't think that serves the public well. I think when you see seniors groups or or school groups come into the legislature during question period, I cringe a little bit. And I think most MLAs do. Why don't you come back later on when we're having a more substantive debate? And I think that we need to, I would prefer to see we stop focusing on question period and start focusing on the real work that MLAs should be doing when they come from the 85 different constituencies right around British Columbia, bringing issues that are relevant to people's lives. They don't see that in question period at all.
I always wonder what the school teachers say to their classes after they've left about behavior in the classroom after they've seen.
Yeah. How do you manage the class after that? Yeah.
We had our clip off the top of the Premier talking about the HST motion that the government put through the House week before last, and we had an opinion poll come out today on the HST. Now, we've had one poll already asking people how they're going to vote in the referendum. This one is from the Angus Reid group. I don't have a graphic on it, but I'll give you the basic number. And essentially, the pollster asked people, reminded people what the question is going to be on the referendum. The ballots start getting mailed out next week, so you may get them by then. And the question is, do you wish to extinguish the HST and go back to the old provincial sales tax, the PST, in combination with GST? So that's paraphrasing the question. And the poll came out. 56% of the people responding to the pollster said they would vote to extinguish the HST, and 44% said no, or they would vote to stick with it. So that's still a pretty good gap.
Well, 12% is a lot to pick up in an election campaign, and we were promised a referendum that was an election-style referendum. Rather than having that, we've got a mail-in ballot. We don't have any spending limits on either side. Ultimately, it's going to be the business groups, the large export-based business groups that are going to benefit the most from the HST. They're going to put a lot of money into ad campaigns. We've already seen that. The government's put $5 million into what they called informational. I would suggest that they're far from informational, the stickman ads that people have been seeing during the hockey games and so on. But 12%, that's a big gap. That's a big gap for those who want to keep the HST. Certainly back in my community, I'm going to small businesses, talking to my neighbors, talking to people on the streets. They don't like the tax. They don't like the way it was brought in. They don't like the fact that things that didn't used to get taxed are taxed now.
Do you have any sense, Shane Simpson, what the challenge in voter turnout is with a mail ballot, where you've got roughly 6 weeks to get people to mark their ballots and mail them in?
Well, I think most of the expectation is that you're going to want to get to people quickly and encourage them to vote fairly quickly after the ballots arrive, because lots of people, it's another envelope and it goes in the pile and it works its way down the pile and it doesn't get dealt with. So I don't expect the turnout to be really high, but there's been a lot of suggestion that it's going to be higher than some people think in terms of, you know, getting close to the 50% range. I think that would be a very good number if it got to 50%. I think part of the problem, and it's reflected in those poll numbers, is the government continues to have a real credibility issue on this, and they are simply not believable. They've changed the story so many times. The story has changed, the numbers have changed, whether it's what the tax will be, the job creation, the costs. All of those things have moved many times, whether it was from the original, the Mintz report that said 113,000 jobs, the Dinning report says 24,000 jobs, which is essentially margin of error over a 10-year period. Whether it's revenue neutral, it's not. So I think the believability is the big issue. People don't believe the BC Liberals, and so they're not being very receptive even to this latest effort by Premier Clark to sell this tax cut.
We have some questions for our panel tonight, for the two New Democrats, comments for them to react to. Since we're on to the HST and things, let's start with Christy Clark on the HST. Here's the Premier.
You know, I think it's fair. And I think one of the things that really sort of changed my view of this was the independent panel report. And the panel report, as you know, said that it was going to cost families on average about $350 more per family under the HST. So what you know, my direction to the finance minister was, look, we have to find a way to make sure that this is fairer for families, recognizing that that $350 is a lot of money for people. And so what we're doing with this, I think, are three things. First, we are getting that $350 number down to zero. Lots of families will be actually better off. We're getting the rate down to 10%, which is lower than what people are paying now, or we're paying under the PST-GST system. And we are finding a way to pay for it by rebalancing the tax burden.
The pollster, John Horgan, said it's tightened up, and I guess compared to, well, it was 10-1 against at one point, so it's tightened up from that.
Well, a lot of the baggage with the tax was the way it was implemented. No discussion before an election. The ultimate time to consult with the public is during an election campaign. But I think Premier Clark's being disingenuous in her comments. At the top of the show, she talked about the motion being binding. I'm fairly confident that the finance minister in 2013 won't necessarily agree with a motion that was passed. What would have been an election will inevitably happen before we get down to 10%, as Ms. Clark suggests the government will go. It's 3 years from now. I hear Kevin Falcon, I hear Christy Clark, I hear members of the BC Liberal Party saying the tax is 10%. It's not. It's 12%. And it will be 12% for at least the next 12 months. And it will be 11% for 2 more years after that. And so I think that the only way they're going to close that gap is to continue to make the case that something will happen in the future if you just trust us. And as Shane said, the public doesn't trust them.
But the finance minister might well be Bruce Ralston.
And then we'll have to deal with that. And we will certainly abide by the decision of the public in the referendum. But we have a whole lot of work to do on rebalancing the tax system. For Christy Clark to suggest that not proceeding with a corporate tax cut is somehow tax reform in British Columbia after 10 years of constant corporate tax cuts, and then insult to injury, a value-added tax that shifts the burden even further from the corporate sector onto consumers. It is, as I said, disingenuous. And I think that it's a big stretch for the Premier to say, as she just did on this program, that it's going to be 10%. It's going to be 10% 3 years from now.
Question for you, Shane Simpson. Here's a toughie. Bill Thielman.
The NDP is investing a lot of effort to defeat the HST, to get a vote of yes to extinguish the HST in the binding referendum this month. What will you do if you lose?
Well, I think, as John said, the first thing we'll do is we'll respect the decision that British Columbians have made. And if British Columbians choose to continue and keep the HST, we'll respect that decision.
Yeah.
And then we'll need to look at the whole broader question of tax policy. And Adrian Dix has talked about that. And we need to have a conversation about how we pay for services. And there's a broad conversation to be had there. And about
how you say conversation, and is that one of the changes we're going to see because of what happened with the HST, that a political party going into an election has really got to tell people what it's planning to do, especially on key things like taxes?
I believe so. I think that that the thing that British Columbians, not just British Columbians, but I think that voters generally are looking for politicians who, first of all, deal seriously with complicated issues that don't necessarily have easy answers, and be as forthright as they can be about how they're going to deal with those things, where they're going to find revenue, what kinds of services realistically can be delivered, and what it's going to cost to do that. And I think there is an expectation, and I believe the result of the initiative around the HST has made it pretty clear that even in some unique situations, people will stand up and make that very clear by doing what 700,000 people did when they signed those petitions and that. So I do believe that that's what will occur. We're going to need to talk about tax policy and about revenue and about programs and about government priorities. And all of that will be the debate in the next election, which will come sometime after the HST vote, where everybody will adjust to whatever the result that British Columbians give us is.
In the leadership race with Adrian Dix, John Horgan, I heard him say at one point, and I heard him say it again when it was over and again on this show, that to emphasize the importance of saying what you're going to do, because that's where your mandate to do it comes from. Like, you've got to tell people where you're headed.
That's absolutely
because that's where your mandate comes from.
And no one wants to back into government. You need to have the people on your side if you're going to affect social, economic, and political change in society. That's why people get involved in politics. Adrian's point of view, and I was with him in the leadership race, ran against him. And he made the case quite strongly against my perspective, which was a tax commission, so that we'd lay it all on the table. He didn't disagree with that notion, But what he said quite passionately and won the day in the contest was you have to lay it out for people, not after the election, but before the election. Interestingly enough, in Ms. Clark's attempt to salvage the HST, she's taken a plank out of Adrian's platform of rolling back the corporate tax cut. And then Mr. Falcon taking our commitment to get to zero on small business tax rates, claiming that we would refuse to do that. So there's a back and forth he said, she said around this particular tax issue, but the whole notion of, as Shane says, how do we pay for services in British Columbia in the next 5 years? And that's going to be the challenge for whoever wins the next election.
I've been keeping a list, though, writing about it this week, Shane Simpson, of the number of reviews that Premier Clark has commissioned on one thing or another. Some of them report back this summer or this spring, but a number of them are post-election, as near as I can determine.
Well, and I think that reflects a concern that I'm hearing, and I'm hearing it from people who might traditionally be supporters of the BC Liberals. And what I'm hearing from them is a sense that, well, Premier Clark was put into office in February, I guess, that there is no sense of what this government's plan is. There is no sense of where she wants to take the province. With Gordon Campbell, you always knew, whether you agreed with him or not, Premier Campbell always had a plan. And
sometimes three or four.
Sometimes three or four, and sometimes they'd change. But there always was a plan of some kind. A sense here that she's kind of gone after one-off issues to deal with things, but where she's taking this government and where she wants to take British Columbia, we haven't seen that plan here. And I think that that's going to be part of the debate as well, is that if we're laying out a pretty clear direction under Adrian coming into the next election versus some grab bag of ideas under the Premier, I'm feeling pretty good about that in terms of where people want to put their confidence.
People will have a chance to judge that, I hope, on this show, and maybe even as soon as this fall. A couple of House Leader questions here, so you can nap if you like, Shane, and we'll go to John Horgan. First one is a comment from Coleman about his relationship with Horgan. Here's Coleman.
Quite well, actually. I sat down right when John became the House Leader. I sat down with him and told him how I wanted to do things differently, and that was I would be very open. I would let him know ahead of time when legislation was coming. I told him that there would be a trust of confidentiality here on certain things that were sensitive, but I would give him a schedule, and that would be updated daily and regularly, so he would have it every day. So my staff do that work. They meet with me, then they take it over to him to make sure he had copies of everything. And for the most part, I think it was a very respectful and worthwhile relationship.
Well,
I'd agree with most of what Rich said there. Both of us, it was new territory. He was appointed House Leader back in February for the 3 or 4 day session. And then the large gap while the leadership campaigns were underway. But for me, it was right out of the leadership, right into the House, and then taking over a job that my colleague Mike Farnworth had been doing for the past 6 years. I'd been on all of the committees that Mike was on. We worked together, but I was now the one that had to go and deal with the government. Adding to that, Coleman's also the energy minister, and I'm the energy critic. So we have to be diplomatic as House leaders, and then the adversarial relationship of minister to critic would kick in throughout the day. On top of that, the single most important constituency issue for me in Juan de Fuca was the deletion of lands from a tree farm license, and Rich Coleman signed that document. So I've been battling with Rich for 3 or 4 years now. Despite all of that, we have a pretty good relationship on the House stuff because you have to have that. And he was true to his word most of the time. Very few surprises from the government. Enough, though, at the end of the day, and there were issues around the appointment of a clerk of the legislature.
Got a question for you on that one.
Well, we can leave that to another question. But a few surprises along the way. The closure issue, we both knew it was coming. We both kind of denied to each other that it was going to happen, but it was inevitable with the amount of work that we had that kept growing as the session dragged on. So, but on balance, on the House Leader front, I thought we got along pretty well. Also on the critic side, to be honest with you, for a guy who was new to the file, I've known the energy stuff for quite some time, and he's a pretty quick study, and we disagreed on quite a few things, but he's knowledgeable and was prepared to offer me briefings that I couldn't get from Blair Leckstrom or Bill Bennett or Richard Neufeld, so I'm optimistic.
Yeah. You referred to it 48 hours to go in the House or thereabouts. The government sprang on the opposition its intention to appoint a new clerk of the House. In the past, this position's only been filled 3 times since the Second World War, so the clerk tends to serve a long time, a very important figure in the House, but it's usually by consensus. In the past, if you look in the journals of the House, you'll find that normally the Leader of the Opposition, Premier would make the motion, the Leader of the Opposition would second it. In this case, you had a vote in the House, and the Opposition, in protest over the way the government had handled it, voted against the motion. Rich Coleman's comment on this follows. Here he is.
I thought it was an unfortunate moment, frankly, in my 15 years here today when they voted the way they did, because it wasn't necessary. They could have stated their case about they would have liked a different process, but not done the thing that would embarrass the one clerk that's being promoted who's sitting at the table, who didn't deserve that behavior today. And I've talked to them since, and I think a number of people on the other side of the House that I spoke to through the day, were regretful, frankly, of how they handled that. But it's done.
It wasn't personal about the clerks.
No, not at all. Kate Ryan Lloyd was appointed deputy clerk. Craig James, who had been appointed to be chief electoral officer, is coming back to fill the clerk position. It's not about the personalities. It's about an open process in the 21st century. And it's also about, Rich said there were going to be no surprises. Well, the Speaker of the House called in Adrian, the Leader of the Opposition, and said, we would like to do this. And Adrian thought about it. He consulted with me, he consulted with, I believe he talked to you, Shane. He talked to a couple of other caucus members about how we should proceed. And we all agreed that it was inappropriate to have a succession for a position in a democratic institution that pays $250,000 a year for the rest of your life. That struck us as inappropriate in the 21st century. And we suggested to the Speaker that the Legislative Management Committee, which consists of myself and Shane and 3 Liberals, they have a majority, let's sit down and review what our options are. There's days left in the session. This is not the right way to do this. We made it clear we would not support it. So for Rich to suggest that it was a surprise to him, we made it abundantly clear to the Speaker, this is the wrong way to go, don't do this. We were compelled to follow through with that. And it's unfortunate for Craig James because he was appointed to be chief electoral officer without the consent of the opposition, which is also a nonpartisan position, one that usually has consensus. And so for Craig, tough 12 months. He's gone from one frying pan into a fire, back into another frying pan. And it's unfortunate that Rich is right. It was a sad day for the legislature, a sad day for the way we run this place. But I think appropriate. It's the 21st century. We have to modernize our institutions, and one way we could start is by appointing a clerk in a more democratic and open way.
There are 2 ways to do these things, and unfortunately, in both these cases, the Liberals chose to do it the way they did. We'll take a brief break on Voice of BC, back with Shane Simpson and John Horgan.
I don't think that Adrian has really distinguished himself from Carol in terms of the way that the NDP comes across. I think that they're still very negative, they're still very confrontational, they're still very much accusing the Liberal government of bad things, and I don't see them coming out with real constructive policies that would be a distinguishing factor for the NDP.
Your source for in-depth local political coverage. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
Crime happens, but where it happens and who becomes the victim can be influenced by you and your community. As the eyes and ears of their neighborhoods, Block Watch programs assist police by reporting suspicious activity.
I'm witnessing a theft from a vehicle.
To learn more about crime prevention in your neighborhood, contact your local police department or the Block Watch Society of BC.
If you would like to contact us at Voice of BC, write to us. Our mailing address is 111 1925 Blanchard Street, Victoria, BC, V8T 4J2, or send us an email to vobc@shaw.ca.
Hi, I'm Nellie Furtado, and I'm stepping up to be the change I want to see in the world. Growing up in British Columbia, surrounded by beautiful mountains, forests, and the ocean right at my doorstep, gave me an immense love of nature that I carry with me everywhere I go. It doesn't take much to disturb this fragile environment, and that's why I need your help before it's too late. Please join me in protecting the places that make this province such a beautiful place to live. Donate to the Land Conservancy of British Columbia at BeTheChangeBC.ca.
One of the criticisms of the NDP's question period strategy in the past has been that the party often follows the media as opposed to presenting the media with new information that it will follow. And I'm not entirely sure why that is.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. We've got some questions for Shane Simpson, and I'm going to plunge straight into them because the last couple of days of the session, Shane tabled a piece of legislation, which they have in some other provinces, but we don't have here in British Columbia, which is a poverty reduction plan, the essence of which is?
Well, essentially, it's to appoint a minister, to put a plan in place through consultation with the interests that need to be part of this discussion, that has clear targets and clear timelines for bringing down rates of poverty in the province and for breaking that poverty cycle in the case of families and kids primarily.
Newfoundland has it, I think. A couple of other provinces.
It's Newfoundland, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba. It's a nonpartisan thing. You can go across and find governments of every political stripe who have engaged poverty reduction strategies. They legislate them in most cases. Some have regulated.
Does it work?
Well, I think it's pretty early on in the process. But like many things that government does, I think it's really essential to sit down, figure out how you're going to get at this. It isn't just about throwing money at it, but how do you deal with the housing issues, the childcare, the training, the education programs? How do you deal with young people and the healthcare issues, nutrition issues? So there's quite a bit to this, and it's really getting at all of those pieces in a way that allows us to make some real progress and to measure that progress and decide whether it's working. That's the way government should probably approach a number of files, and with poverty certainly.
Question for you from Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Gregory Thomas. Here's Gregory.
Well, the NDP introduced the Poverty Reduction Act into the legislature, and of course it didn't pass, but it signaled an indication to really look at reducing poverty. My question is, what impact are taxpayers and the income-generating segment of British Columbia's economy going to have on poverty reduction strategy that the NDP develops going forward?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I think, first of all, there's obviously going to be a cost to putting this kind of plan in place. But increasingly what we're seeing now is more and more information starting to become available about the cost of poverty. And not just in social terms, but in economic and bottom line terms, in terms of cost to government, cost effects on health care, on the judicial system, a whole array of areas. And we're seeing more and more of that work being done at our universities now to try to measure that. And I think we have to understand that issue better as to what's the real costs of not doing anything. And then measure that against the costs of doing something. The other thing that we need to do, I think, is look at places where, particularly for employables, single employables, where I think we need to look at how you support that. There may be tools through exemptions and things that allow people to earn a little bit of money to supplement and to move forward and start to break that cycle by having some benefit for doing that. Today we have no exemptions in this province. We claw every dollar back. And I think that is the inclination there is to lock people into poverty and into welfare when you do that. And we should be looking at ways to incentivize this a little bit, to give people who have that opportunity and some wherewithal to get out and move on and get back into the workforce.
I've actually got a question coming up for you on that, but before we get to the earnings exemption question, Seth Klein on welfare rates in general. Here's Seth.
The last time welfare benefit rates were increased was 2007. I know that you believe they should be increased, but what should our welfare benefit rates actually be?
I think that's a good question. There's a couple of answers to that. One is, I think we need to look at how we deliver welfare. We currently deliver it where we deliver a shelter portion and then a portion that pays for everything else. Well, what we know is that if landlords just absorb that whole shelter portion as a rule, so we don't know how much farther ahead we get with that. We also know that welfare is a different challenge in different places in the province. In Victoria and Vancouver, with the high cost of housing and a lack of available and affordable housing, it becomes a real challenge. In the interior, the challenge is different. So maybe we're looking at something where the rates don't need to be the same in every part of the province there. So I think we need to look at the rates, but they are too low. There's no question about that. But we need to combine that also with earning exemptions, with some of the programs that allow people to find money in other ways and get other income. So that's all going to be part of this conversation that a Poverty Reduction Act allows us to have.
Andrew McLeod of the Tyee, and here it is, earning exemptions. Here's Andrew.
Shane, successive Liberal social development ministers have opposed putting back in an earnings exemption that allows people on welfare to earn a little bit of money before their checks are clawed back from the government. I'm wondering what you think of that policy and what the NDP might do differently on it.
Is this calculated like a percentage, or would it be a certain amount of dollars, or
Well,
what would it be?
It's different in different jurisdictions. But here in British Columbia, they take it dollar for dollar. So if you're a single person on welfare, you get $610 a month. If you find a way to earn $100 somewhere else, they take the whole $100 back, or else you commit fraud and don't tell anybody that you've earned it. So you don't get 10 cents of that. So why do you go and earn it?
There's no incentive at all.
There's none. We support an earning exemption strategy. We know that currently there's earning exemptions essentially for persons on disabilities. They have an earning exemption that's allowable. It's $500, and that's a good thing. But we think we need to put more earning exemptions in place. The other thing that kind of complements this is there's a community service program that's terribly underfunded that allows particularly people to apply to go and work for volunteer organizations, credible organizations, and to get another $100 a month for putting volunteer hours in. And that's a real positive thing to do, particularly for single moms maybe who aren't finding work, to get out, to engage in a positive community activity, and to see a little bit of a benefit for that. So the combination of exemptions, of those kind of programs, all of these are small steps to get us to a place where people get to break that cycle. And we really need to focus some attention on that, on how we get people out of the welfare cycle.
It's interesting that you'd think a right-wing government would understand financial incentives. Like
You would
it's
think.
one of those counterintuitive ideas. You're probably wondering whatever happened to the NDP's energy critic, who's supposed to be on the show tonight. So we have a question for him. And it's coming from the Attorney General of British Columbia freelancing on somebody else's topic. Here's Barry Penner.
You've had a number of conflicting positions over the years about Site C, just like your parties had conflicting positions for and against the carbon tax. If I understand correctly, your most recent comment is that you're not convinced we need the power from Site C now in British Columbia, but Site C won't be built now. It'll take 10 or 15 years to go through the approval process, environmental assessment, and First Nations consultation, never mind being actually constructed. So is it your party's position that we should wait until the lights are flickering in British Columbia before we start planning for our future needs?
Wow. 4 different people taped questions for John Horgan on his flip-flop, as they described it, on Site C. So there's your chance to answer.
I've had a few positions on this show on Site C, Vaughn. So, but wow, to see my friend Barry, he said 10 to 15 years for Site C. Kind of makes you wonder why Premier Campbell harnessed a few Lear jets and flew hundreds of people up to Hudson's Hope to announce an environmental assessment, which is what, of course, the BC Liberals did last year with much fanfare. They've just announced again that the $6 billion project is now closer to $8 billion. And they've gone no further to address the First Nations concerns, which ultimately made me change my view on the matter. They've done nothing to quantify the value of the agricultural land, not in terms of monetary value, but value to the people in the region and to the people of British Columbia. So there are a series of outstanding issues. On the question of whether or not we need the power, How I got to that point of view was a result of the number of mill closures that we experienced over the past 5 years. Every time we reduce our industrial load, we have surplus electricity. So every mill that goes down is a windfall for the owners of the shareholders in the mill or in that forestry company, but it's an impact on BC Hydro. One of the challenges we've seen and why there's a review now of our rate structure is that the industrial rate for electricity is below what we're paying for new independent power supply. So we are losing money by buying electricity and then selling it to industrial users. That's why I've shifted my position on Site C. I do believe that hydroelectricity is the cleanest, greenest option we have available. Site C was the next best option according to BC Hydro. Now I believe it's time for them to prove that. Not in an ephemeral way, but in a substantive way, looking at First Nations issues, looking at the environment, and looking at, most importantly, that agricultural land, which would be the largest deletion in agricultural land reserve history.
There is no question in your mind, though, that if we wanted to do something like Site C, we're going to have to get, it's going to take 10 years. We can't know what the power demand will be in 10 years. So we have to get going, at least going through the first few hoops.
Oh, absolutely. And on this show, I've said that we should do that. We should proceed with the environmental assessment. We should answer those outstanding questions.
Deal with the First Nation issue.
Exactly. And if it comes to pass that this is the next best option, the next best public option for electricity generation, and we do require the electricity, and we can address those outstanding issues, let's proceed.
I think the Liberals may put together a little bound volume of John Horgan's positions on... it's nuanced, okay? Well, we'll just call it that.
Life's not black and white. Yeah. It's gray. And
my politics.
Well, it's a problem. It's a problem. I grapple with it every day.
We all. We got a question for you from Jock Finlayson. Here he is.
Canada is a big producer and exporter of energy, but at the moment we sell only to one other foreign market, namely the United States. Many people believe that we would realize a higher return from our energy exports if we could access offshore markets. Do you agree with that logic, and do you further agree that we should be looking to open up the capacity to export oil and natural gas to Asia?
China.
I agree with most of what Jock said there, and I've said on this show how many times Jock and I agree, surprisingly, coming from the perspectives that we do. I don't believe that when he says oil, he's not referring to BC oil, he's referring to Alberta crude. Natural gas is what we produce here in abundance, and we do sell it into a flooded market, mostly in the United States. There are proposals to put liquid natural gas facilities, LNG plants, in Kitimat and in Prince Rupert that would provide jobs in those communities, desperately needed jobs in those communities. It would take a natural resource that belongs to British Columbians and find a better market in Asia, and I support that. So does the NDP caucus.
So
the challenge on oil, when he mixes oil into the question, when we talk about the oil and gas sector in BC, Vaughn, we're really talking about natural gas. We produce very little oil. It's infinitesimal.
But to clarify, it's a different pipeline and a different facility.
Correct.
And a different good you're shipping across the Pacific.
Right. And a different
you're bringing natural gas from British Columbia's northeast by pipeline to either Kitimat or Rupert, liquefying it and shipping it out.
Correct. And LNG doesn't stick to things. It blows up or it vents. So the environmental consequence of a catastrophe with an LNG tanker is relatively insignificant. You've got the GHG or greenhouse gas impact of venting that gas if there should be a rupture. With crude oil, it sticks to things. We've seen that in the Gulf. We've seen that as a result of the Exxon Valdez. So the risk to our coastline from LNG is insignificant. The benefit to British Columbians is quite significant, and it's our resource. So we'll get the royalties for extracting it, we'll get value added by getting it to an LNG facility, and then we'll get a better price for it in Asia.
The Chinese pay a lot more.
Three times the North American rate. So I'm fully in agreement with Jock. If you take the oil component out, you focus on the natural gas and you focus on BC first.
And you can't have one without the other, right? You don't need an oil pipeline to make the gas pipeline.
Not at all. Not at all.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC with John Horgan and Shane Simpson. Stay with us.
Everything that we're seeing indicates that we have tremendous amounts of natural gas available in the northeast of the province, but The thing I really wonder about is what the positions of the parties are going to be to ensure that those resources are developed in a way that doesn't compromise the province's ability to meet its climate change objectives. And I think that this is a very serious issue that the NDP in particular needs to speak out on.
Producing over 9,000 hours of local programming every year. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
As I'm driving to work, I can feel the anxiety building. My stomach starts to get sick. I start to sweat.
It's a feeling of terror, like a life and death situation, basically.
I always feel like I'm, under a spotlight.
I would kill myself at a certain point if things didn't get better.
Anxiety and depressive disorders are the most common of all mental illnesses. For a free mental health screening, call our toll-free number or visit our website today.
Miss something on Voice of BC? Catch an encore presentation of this show on your local Shaw TV. If you live in the Lower Mainland, Voice of BC rebroadcasts Saturday morning at 10:30 and Sunday afternoon at 4. On Vancouver Island, watch Voice of BC Saturday at 10 a.m. or Sunday afternoon at 2. To find out when Voice of BC rebroadcasts in all other parts of the province, please contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area.
Kidney disease affects an estimated 2 million Canadians. Many don't even know they have it. But thanks to the Kidney Foundation of Canada's innovative programs and vital research, countless people have been able to turn to us to help them manage, delay, and in some cases even prevent the disease. We're the Kidney Foundation of Canada. Please support us. We're behind you, all the way.
It would be nice to have a magic wand to get everybody off the street, but the real challenge in social housing is how to deal with mental illness and drug addiction. It's more than social housing, it's a mix of services that are needed.
Next week on Voice of BC, my dear friends, Keith Baldry and Justine Hunter, and the media panel and the view from the press gallery, and a chance to go over a lot of stuff that's happened since it seems eons ago that Justine and Keith and I were doing those leadership debates. So it'll be good to have them on. Tonight, we've got Shane Simpson and John Horgan on the show, and we get straight back into questions. We've got a couple more questions for Horgan on the energy file, and here is his pal, Rich Coleman, explaining why it is that on day one on the job, he said that the smart meters needed a sober second look, and a week later he decided they were a pretty darn good idea. Here's Rich Coleman.
So there's the smart grid, down to a smart meter. It's a smarter system, and we should find some savings. And then you ask the next question. Can you buy the old meters anymore? The answer is no. We're going to have to change these eventually anyway. Some of the old mechanical meters will last another 10 or 20 years. Some will break down. But the reality is, you have to decide to modernize your system at some point.
Basically, they showed them that they'd already bought the things.
Pretty much. The contracts were signed, that we were locked in, and that's the challenge with the smart meter program as I understand it today. We had very few hours to discuss energy issues, Coleman and I, because we were giving time to other ministries for debate. But the smart meter issue is one that I've been singing about for at least the past 3 years. The last, 3 ministers ago, because we had a flurry of energy ministers between Campbell and Clark, I asked Blair Leckstrom, will there be a business plan, and will this be thoroughly vetted by the BC Utilities Commission? And I got a big affirmative from Blair. Absolutely, you bet, you can count on it, take it to the bank. And 6 months later, we were passing the Clean Energy Act, exempting the smart meter program from any oversight, no business plan. I have to say, Vaughn, if a New Democrat minister said, I'm going to spend $1 billion, trust me, I can't find parts for the old car, there would be howls in the street. Certainly Jock Finlayson would be making noise. The notion that Liberals can, in my view, waste $1 billion when we could spend that on energy retrofits, what would be one of the largest job creation plans we could have, making our infrastructure more energy efficient rather than just quantifying what we're using. And that's all the meter will do. And then there's the health issues.
And that's what the Utilities Commission is for, right? You got a monopoly, so you have an independent regulator that tells you whether they're wasting money or empire building or this is actually needed.
That's right.
And the Liberals have exempted pretty much every interesting issue that you could ask an Utilities Commission from the Act.
At $10 billion worth of infrastructure that is not getting oversight. What I know for certain, Vaughn, is that Cabinet is not where those decisions should be made. If we're going to have a Crown Corporation that has historically been so valuable to British Columbians in BC Hydro, providing job creation, providing revenue to the Crown, and just keeping the province moving, keeping the lights on, keeping our industries competitive, the last people I would want making those decisions are politicians, New Democrats or Liberals. The Utilities Commission is there to protect ratepayers and to ensure that the utility is run efficiently. You don't do that by exempting $10 billion. And the smart meter program is the worst $1 billion I believe we can spend right now.
Bernard von Schulman with a question. You can jump in on this one. Do you know what your policy is on mining, Shane Simpson?
No, I know a little bit.
Here's your
about
big chance to answer.
We'll see.
Bernard von Schulman, NDP Mining. Here we go.
The one sector of the BC economy that has always had the biggest problem with the NDP is the mining sector. 1972 to 75, the mining sector fled the province. The 1990s, the mining sector was not exactly thrilled with the NDP. What will the NDP do, should it become government, to ensure that the mining sector does not shut down in this province?
You'll get one later.
Thanks, Bernard, for the question. I often say that the only certainty when I go to the mineral roundup every January in Vancouver, for the past 5 years I've been the energy critic, and every year there's been a new mines minister. So the only certainty in the sector is the new Democrat critic these days. Bernard is correct. The sector has had a rocky relationship with New Democrats. I can't be accountable for the Barrett government. I can barely be accountable for the Harcourt government. What I can be accountable for sure, is a Dix government and what role I may or may not have in that. And we've sent pretty clear signals to the mining industry. We want you here. We recognize that as we see a significant downturn in the forestry sector in rural British Columbia, mining is the next best option for job creation and wealth creation in British Columbia. But you've got to do a few things. You've got to absolutely respect First Nations rights and title. You have to include them in your process. You have to pay fair wages, and you have to pay some taxes. You want to do those three things, the mining sector will flourish in British Columbia. But we've had a couple of bumps along the way, and the Taseko mine issue, the Prosperity mine in the interior, is a classic example of how a company should not proceed.
Has that thing got a chance now, or is it so turned off everybody so much it probably can't be saved?
Well, certainly Premier Clark.
It's a gold, copper, billion dollar mine? Something like that.
About that.
Near Williams Lake.
That's right, just in the Chilcotin. Unceded territory, contentious issue with the Chilcotin Nation. And to be honest, Vaughn, the company just botched it.
That's what Rich Coleman said on the show here last week as well. You guys agree?
And how? Well, we've agreed on a couple of things. If he gets rid of the smart meters, we're off to the races. But what they need to do is not just reapply, which is what they've done. They need to sit down with the Chilcotin and say, how do we proceed? And they don't appear to be prepared to do that. Premier Clark and Adrian Dix were both speaking to the summit today, First Nations Summit.
Yeah.
And this is certainly a top of mind issue. But there are other mining opportunities in British Columbia in the northwest. The Red Chris mine just outside of Iskut. Galore Creek was supposed to be the next bonanza. A calculation error of a couple of $1 billion on the capital plan saw that stock drop pretty quickly. But copper prices have never been higher, and mostly driven by demand in Asia. So we have an abundance of geological wealth here, and there hasn't been a significant mine open in British Columbia, a new mine, since the 1990s. So even though we've had record prices and we've had a lot of mineral exploration, we haven't had any new mines come online. And that requires companies to sit down with communities, to sit down with First Nations, a mining commission, an oil and gas commission type office where you can have one-stop shopping for First Nations, for communities, and for investors is, in our view, the solution on the mining front. But it takes a lot of hard work, and people have to roll up their sleeves and not expect entitlement. They have to expect they're going to have to work hard and compromise if they're going to be successful in BC.
It's interesting that Coleman said almost exactly the same thing on this show last week. He said that he started to talk to the Chilcotin Nation, but he said, we're just talking. We won't get to the mine until we've rebuilt a relationship around a whole bunch of other things. But he said, you know, I've dealt with them before. They're nice people. You know, they're in the long run, these are people that you're going to be able to deal with, but you're going to have to treat them with respect.
I think the thing you're going to find, and it's reflected in the relationship with First Nations, and we've seen it around the debates around the oil pipeline and that, the reaction of First Nations there, and we continue to not engage, and the government is continuing to not engage in the kinds of discussions I think the First Nations are looking for in order to resolve some of these issues. And we're going to need to be able to resolve the First Nations questions, as we also need to be respectful of the environmental questions, and many of them overlap. And the government has not done a good job on that. Industry has not done a great job on that, and the government has not held them to account as well. And I think that's part of the problem that we have with these things.
Ben Parfit wants to give you a hard time for your position on natural gas. Here's Ben.
As most of us know, British Columbia is endowed with an incredibly rich natural gas resource. I'm wondering, however, what the NDP's views are on developing that resource. It seems to me that there's very little to differentiate between the NDP and Liberal positions on developing unconventional natural gas resources in the province. And I'm wondering what the NDP believes should be done to ensure that those resources are developed in a manner that does not compromise water and that does not result in the province seeing its greenhouse gas emissions ratchet up to terrible levels.
Very good questions from Ben. He and I have sat down and talked about these issues, mostly around the hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's called. Uses a great deal of water to break the rock formation, the shale formation, to release the natural gas. And that's what's called unconventional gas. We have an abundance of it here. Ben is right. I believe, as Jock Finlayson pointed out, that if you can almost find unconventional gas in any jurisdiction in North America. Quebec, there was a bit of a gold rush there. They put a moratorium in place because they didn't have any understanding of how you develop that industry. British Columbia is a mature gas sector. We've been doing this for quite a while. We're getting better at it. It uses a great deal of water, creates toxic water as a result. There's talk about draining or putting a pipeline in the Williston Reservoir, which is there to hold water for electricity generation so that they can feed the oil and gas sector in the Northeast. That causes me significant concern. My colleague Rob Fleming and I have been working together to try and find a better place for us to be in the future on natural gas, but I believe the best place for us to be is to get to a market where we can get a better return, and that's where the LNG proposal we talked about earlier comes into play.
Interesting comment here, Shane Simpson, on housing strategy, and just a moment of background. Rich Coleman's on the show last week, and he got a question from the Taxpayers Federation about the cost of what the government was spending on housing and programs to release homelessness. And he said something that, if you were watching the show earlier, is going to sound a lot like what Shane Simpson said, that when you're doing a program like that, you got to look at the cost right across society of homelessness, not just at what it's costing you to deal with homelessness. Here's Rich Coleman.
I believe that we're there for all of society and for government, and the cost of someone being homeless is actually a higher cost than actually having them houses stabilized. If you can get them into housing, you can take care of their mental health addictions, you can stabilize them with their medical needs, you can give them a more stable life and turn their lives around. And that's the objective here. When I did the housing strategy in 2006, I knew it was going to take time. I knew that we had to buy some stuff and renovate it, and everybody focuses downtown east side when they talk about this issue. I don't. Well, it's a provincial focus for me. So we have done things in Victoria, Nanaimo, Campbell River, Kelowna, Penticton, Quesnel, Prince George.
That's a bit like the philosophy of your Poverty Reduction Act.
Well, a little bit. I think the reality is, though, that British Columbia doesn't have a housing strategy. British Columbia has a homelessness strategy, and the minister has done some work there, and we've seen that initiative with the SRO purchases with some units around assisted supports and supported housing. And those are good things, no doubt. But we really do need a housing strategy in British Columbia, and the area that, and we need to continue those supports. But when you look at homelessness, one of the things in the homelessness count that came out a while ago that's very concerning to me, 29% increase in youth homelessness in Vancouver. Young people living on the street. real big problem not getting addressed, not enough resources. The other is family housing for poor and vulnerable families with young kids. We haven't, for 10 years, the government has done nothing. The most significant initiative was tearing down 224 units of housing at Little Mountain Housing Project in Vancouver. So there's been no program there. A rent assistance program maybe affects 9,000 or 10,000 families. But we have 500,000 people who are in a desperate situation with 120,000 of them being kids. And we're not seeing a housing strategy there. And that's what we need to put in place. Not cheap, not easy, especially if the federal government's not at the table. But we need to get our head around that, and the government hasn't done that.
You're going to love this one, Shane. Here is David Schreck.
Shane, you have the job of putting questions to Harry Bloy in question period. You have my sympathy. How do you deal with that task without appearing to pick on him?
Well,
He's had a shaky beginning as a minister.
He has, and I think the reality is this. I like Harry Bloy just fine. But I think that it shows it was Premier Clark's judgment. You'll know that Harry Bloy was the only MLA to support her, who had confidence enough in her as a candidate for leader to endorse her leadership bid. He got his reward, which was social development. My concern isn't that he got a cabinet post, but this is the third largest, financially, the third largest post, and it's the one that more than any other deals with vulnerable people who are very fragile. And I simply think that Harry was misplaced to be put in that ministry. There were other options available there. And I do worry that in the long run, we're not going to see the kind of supports that are needed to be put in place, and we're not going to see the advocacy at the table.
Andrew McLeod, I think there's time to get this one in. It's for John Horgan. Here's Andrew.
John, in the fall, when Carol James was being pushed out of the leadership of the NDP, you were a vocal supporter of her. Then partway through the leadership race, when you were running, you said that you thought maybe the stuff that happened in the fall was for the best in the end. I'm wondering now, a few months later, that you've had time to think about it, what you think.
Well, I think that Andrew's mischaracterizing what the point I was trying to make at the time. I wanted Carol James to stay on as leader. I supported her till the last moment. When I was answering that question, it was, you're in the midst of a leadership race, is it worth it? And on balance, I'd have to say, yes, it was. On a personal level, I enjoyed myself a great deal. I met fantastic people. I was able to raise issues that were important to me. And I saw the NDP become energized through that process, whether it was people supporting Mike Farnworth, people supporting myself, Adrian Dix, Nick Simons, even Dana Larson. Good, solid candidates bringing up issues. And what excited me at the point that I talked to Andrew was, I believe that the party is benefiting from this process. I wouldn't have predicted that 6 months earlier, and that's why I made the comment.
Yeah, no, I would say a lot of us, and Paul Ramsey, I know, said it on the show, that, you know, we thought the fallout from that ouster would be a lot more bitter than it has been. Now, exactly. James herself, I notice, is up on her feet in the House asking questions. She's made the transition a lot easier by not publicly, anyway, showing any regrets about what happened.
You know, and I know this as chair of the caucus, and the caucus has come together, and I think there obviously, you know, there were a number of feelings and very different views around that, but everybody came together very quickly with the focus that our obligation is not how we exchange with each other. Our obligation is to present a credible alternative for the people of British Columbia that can govern, and everybody looked forward on that. And I think that it's worked well, and the caucus has come together.
And on that note, we will wrap it up. Thank you, Shane Simpson. Thank you, John Horgan, for being on the show. Appreciate it. Thank you for watching Voice of BC. Next week on the show, the media panel, bringing the legislature and BC politics into your living room. Good night.